Previously, I already did a video on how Victor Wembanyama is perfect for the Spurs. While that video was received very well, it was made obviously before we had the draft pick and also when we had some other players. So I think it's time for a redo and a more in-depth analysis. Now that the draft lottery is over as well, I will be trying to make a video on every lottery team after this, so please stay tuned. I'm going to break this video down into 3 parts: defense, offense, and culture. First things first, let's start at the beginning. In 1997, the Spurs were dead last in defensive rating. Following this, the Spurs would go on to select Tim Duncan with the first pick. Immediately after, the Spurs jumped up to the very top in defensive rating and would continue to stay in the top 3 every year up until 2007. Tim Duncan went on to win 15 All-Defensive Team selections and 4 Defensive Player of the Years, leading the Spurs to 5 rings. This helped spawn the phrase, "defense wins championships," which continued to carry on for years by other teams as well. In 2008, the Celtics won the championship when they took over the best defensive rating from the Spurs. In 2009, the Lakers won with the best defensive rating in the playoffs. In 2011, the finals were between the Mavs and the Heat, with the 4th and 5th rating in the playoffs respectively, with Dallas winning. The Heat would then go on to win the next 2 years with the number 1 defensive rating in the playoffs and top 5 in regular season in 2012. The Spurs won another championship in 2014 with the best playoff defensive rating as well, and top 5 in regular season defense for the first time since 2007. What made the Spurs make this resurgence again in 2014? The same man that won Finals MVP that year. In 2011, the Spurs drafted Kawhi Leonard. In 2011, Kawhi's biggest strength was his defense, averaging 1.4 steals, a block, and 10 rebounds in college. In 2014, the Spurs were back in the top 5 in defense for the first time in 2007, as we said, and continued to be in the top 5 until 2019, when Kawhi left for Toronto, and Toronto ended up winning the championship. Unfortunately, after the Raptors made the finals, however, the Spurs would drop once again to the 20th place in defensive rating. These past 4 years are really where the Spurs have struggled. Something needed to change. Year after year, the Spurs have drafted for defense ever since 1997. This is what has been proven to be successful, regardless of which way the league shifts offensively versus defensively. In 2023, the Spurs drafted Sohan to fill these needs, who we'll get into later. So now that I've rambled about the Spurs and defense, how is this relevant to Wembanyama? Well, plenty can be said about Wembanyama's defense. I mean, he's almost 7.5 feet tall. What more can be said? Wembanyama is currently averaging 3 blocks a game. While he isn't in the NBA yet, so these numbers are subject to change. But just for reference, David Robinson, another great Spur, averaged 2.99 in his highest blocks per game season, at 4th all-time for highest blocks per game in a season. Hakeem averaged 3.09, and Mark Eaton, at number 1 blocks per game in a season, averaged 3.5 blocks per game. Even if Wembanyama lost a block per game transitioning to the NBA, he would still be top 20 all-time, alongside with Tim Duncan's incredible defense, as we mentioned before. With these per game stats, Hakeem, Tim Duncan, and David Robinson all are in the top 7 for blocks all time. With Wembanyama's height, when people say he can block anywhere on the floor, they mean anywhere on the floor. It is a genuine difficult feat to shoot over Wembanyama, considering sometimes he doesn't even need to jump to block. What stands out about Wembanyama is also his accuracy with his blocks, meaning that he has a good block to foul ratio compared to most centers. Wembanyama is averaging the previously mentioned 3 blocks per game compared to the previous Spurs center, Podol, at 3 fouls per game with only 1.3 blocks. Gobert, at a similar height as well, averages 3 fouls and 1.4 blocks. And even the great Jokic, who's making a run in the finals right now, has 2.5 fouls a game to his 0.7 blocks. This also pairs well with Jeremy Sohan's defense. I told you that we would bring up Sohan again, so where Wembanyama is great at blocks, Sohan is great at steals. Despite the tank and the Spurs losing, Sohan has been a powerhouse on defense. He does have room for improvement, averaging 0.8 steals per 2.5 fouls, but the film speaks for itself, and San Antonio is the best place for development. Pairing Sohan's perimeter defense and arc defense with Wembanyama's defense would be nasty for any offense to power through, especially if both work on their weaknesses. This pairing could ultimately end up to being similar to a Tim Duncan and Manu defense, with Sohan swiping the ball the same way that Manu did, and Wembanyama blocking anything that goes up towards the basket. Much like Wembanyama's defense, what can really be said about Wembanyama's offense? It sounds cliche, but the man can really do anything. As it's been put before, he's a KD that can play defense. Let's break that statement down a little to understand it a little bit better. We already talked about his defense, but when people call him KD, what do they really mean? Well, they have similar playstyles and similar strengths and weaknesses. If some of you recall, I made a video about the resurgence of the mid-range jumper, and the biggest users of this shot are Kevin Durant and DeMar DeRozan. KD has perfected his mid-range game, and there's one big reason for this: his build. Much like Wembanyama, KD is very skinny, but more importantly, a big asset is his height. While some players create space horizontally, like James Harden and Curry, with things like their step back or simply getting space between the defender with handles and screens, players like KD and Wembanyama create space vertically by utilizing this height and creating very high releases. While not every big can shoot threes still, we have been seeing this be more utilized around the league and is a big reason why we've seen more centers around the league shoot threes. Karl Anthony Towns' biggest threes are over defenders, such as this clip here where he shoots over this defender with such a high release. And even in this past conference finals, Jokic utilizes a slight height advantage to hit this shot over AD. And Jokic recognizes AD is not positioned in a way to explode up to block this shot, and has a high release even over the tall AD. Kevin Durant does the exact same thing with his mid-range and threes, making him so deadly if he can jump. And you can see that in all of these clips here. So now take that with KD and add about 1.5 foot onto it, with Wembanyama being 4 to 6 inches taller than Kevin Durant depending on reports, and a 7-inch longer wingspan. As you can see in all of these clips, Wembanyama's release is insanely high, as his peak goes almost over the shot clock. Even the announcers say it's unguardable, and it truly is. Wembanyama can create space vertically and shoot over literally any defender. Another thing that is comparable to KD is Wembanyama's ball handling. KD has always had amazing handles, typically making him the number one option. Despite being a big, KD is able to cross up multiple defenders and create openings to the basket. Wembanyama is able to do the same, implementing crossovers, spin moves, and other ball handling skills into his game. He does this so well to the point that Kevin Garnett even suggested starting him at point guard, despite Wembanyama being 7'6". Now that his KD comparison is out of the way, let's talk about his frame and how Wembanyama posts up. Despite the fact Wembanyama is seen as skinny and has his fair share of problems, he isn't getting blown over by a gust of wind either. Despite his frame, Wembanyama is able to post up and make his way through the paint. Whether this will hold up in the NBA against bigger and more physical defenders like Giannis and Draymond is debatable, but it definitely is something to make note of that he has a lot more physicality than people give him credit for. This will pair well with screening for people like Malachi, who is incredible off of the pick and roll. His ball handling and shooting will also make up for a huge weakness in the Spurs. Despite having multiple guards, these are huge weak points on the Spurs roster. The Spurs originally had a solution drafted for these problems, but yeah. To finalize my thoughts on Wembanyama's offense, I will refer once again to his height. All I can say is posters, posters, posters. With Wembanyama's height, he can basically dunk from anywhere, as I'm sure you've all seen the clip of him shooting a three and missing only to get his own rebound and dunk it. Wembanyama is really going to be out here pulling some Space Jam arm stretches on people with his wingspan, and it will surely bring a sight to see. In terms of culture, Wembanyama wants to be a Spur. That says a lot for what the team means to him and his connection to the Spurs. It's been said a million times, and it will probably be said a million more, but France has a huge connection to the Spurs. The Spurs have always had a connection to international players, but France especially loves San Antonio, and Tony Parker plays a huge, massive role in that. Tony Parker was one of Wembanyama's mentors as well, and now there are reports that Tim Duncan will also come back to help develop Wembanyama's game. This helps a lot, as this is a huge sign that Wembanyama will stay with the Spurs for a long time, as well as he already has an idea of the culture in San Antonio and what his role will be. I won't spend too much time on the connection the Spurs have with France, as ESPN has already made tons of interviews about that. However, Popovich will definitely make the right coaching decisions with him, as he always has with Tim Duncan and David Robinson, creating a system that benefits each player to their maximum potential. What's important to note too is the money that Wembanyama will bring in. Despite Wembanyama being aware of the Spurs family and team culture, it's no secret the Spurs will probably play through him, just like they did through Tim Duncan. And he obviously has a fair share of ball handling and dunks, as we mentioned before. Wembanyama is one of the most hyped prospects in basketball, right there with LeBron, with his games being streamed even far before the draft lottery. Well, if you put the puzzle pieces together, this will bring in a lot of revenue for the Spurs, between more ticket sales, more jersey sales, and more games being streamed on TV. LeBron made millions of dollars for Cleveland's economy, and the same will probably be said for Wembanyama. So the franchise can use this money for many different things, and it may affect how many games are played in Mexico or Austin from now on, as this was a way to promote games to bigger audiences. This money making from Wembanyama is massive for the franchise and could have many different rippling effects, so it should not go unmentioned. As for everything else, what can be said about the culture that hasn't been said already, as I already said? ESPN has done so many interviews about this. Wembanyama loves the Spurs, and the Spurs love Wembanyama. It's a mutual respect relationship that will most likely continue for a long time, as Wembanyama only further develops and gets better, and we could see a lot more championships come to the Alamo City. With that being said, I conclude this full in-depth analysis of Wembanyama's game, both on and off the court, and I look forward to seeing it come to fruition. I hope you guys enjoyed, and don't forget to subscribe and share the video around, as it really does help me out. My last few videos have reached over 3,000 views, and I really appreciate that, as it really does help me out. I'm trying to hit 800 before the end of the year, and y'all are really making it seem like it's possible. I hope to see y'all in the next one, and peace out.
This is not okay. This needs to stop now.